Welcome to our next video in our oil heating series. We're going to jump into a little bit of code because, as we discussed earlier, building code and fire protection code is extremely important as we deal with any oil burning appliance. Think about it. We have sometimes close to 250 gallons of fuel sitting in someone's basement or outside their house. It is an environmental hazard. It can be a fire hazard, and it definitely is not something we want to take lightly. So, the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA, as we'll refer to it going further, has developed a series of codes dealing with oil burning equipment. Now, these are all referenced by International Mechanical Code, Common Building Code. So, every one of the individual codes does reference back to the NFPA 31 standard for oil burning equipment. Now, going through code sometimes is a little bit dry. There's really no other way to do it. And you just have to understand, you don't have to memorize code. We don't expect you to absolutely memorize code. But we do expect that you'll be able to find the code when you need it. Now, small things like installation clearances, how things are put together, yeah, you do need to know that because you're going to use that every day. But you also need to know where to look it up. So, this is going to be chapter 1 of the NFPA 31. Okay, we are actually using the 2011 edition for this slide presentation, but more recent editions have not changed that much. They might update a little bit of the information on efficiencies and stuff like that, and as we move forward into later chapters, you'll see that it doesn't change that much between editions. We'll bring out those changes as we discuss. Okay, so this edition of the NFPA 31, okay, was issued by the Standards Council on December 14th, 2010, with an effective date of January 3rd, 2011, and it supersedes all previous editions. Okay, it was approved as a national standard on January 3rd, 2011. Now, some states have actually moved up to 2013 code at this point. Some have moved to 2017, but it all depends on the state and the jurisdiction you are working within. States are notoriously slow for adopting new codes, and that is because it is a lot of change sometimes. Okay, and it does affect the cost of construction, and it affects how things are done. So usually states will spend a lot of time evaluating codes and code changes and say, is this even worth going to the next edition? Just because the NFPA says we need to update this code does not mean that a state is going to approve it. So make sure you are looking at the version of the code that your state or the state you're doing work in has approved. For example, I'm licensed in both Connecticut and Florida. Granted, we don't do a lot of oil down here in Florida, but there's other NFPA codes. So Connecticut is always running a little bit behind on codes compared to Florida. Massachusetts is always running a little bit ahead. So a lot of it depends on what state you're in. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about the layout of Chapter 1. Chapter 1 sets the standards for who's going to administer the code, how big of a scope the code has, what's the purpose of the code, and it also goes into some definitions and stuff like that, as you'll see. So Chapter 1 sometimes, okay, and then you look to the right of it, you see the page numbers. Okay, so the scope of the code basically says this standard will apply to the installation of stationary liquid fuel burning appliances, included but not limited to industrial, commercial, and residential type steam, hot water, or warm air heating appliances, domestic type range burners, space heaters, and portable liquid fuel burning appliances. So in other words, it applies to everything that is installed in a building that uses liquid as a fuel. This standard should also apply to all accessories and control systems. Okay, covers all the control systems, wiring, and everything else that is connected to or controlling a liquid fuel burning appliances. This standard should also apply to the installation of liquid fuel storage and supply systems. Okay, in other words, your oil tank and all the pipes connecting to it are also covered by NFPA 31. And it also applies to those multi-fueled appliances in which liquid fuel is one of the standards or optional fuels. This says that if there's more than one fuel source, in other words, if the appliance can be changed between natural gas or propane and oil, depending on which one is less expensive at the time, it still applies because there is a liquid fuel involved. Now, they did add, and you'll see the little asterisk next to it. That means it's relatively new and there's more to it. This standard shall not apply to internal combustion engines, oil lamps, or portable devices not specifically covered in this standard. Okay, and then it puts a side note. Chapter 11 is going to talk more about the portable devices that are covered. However, is a diesel engine, diesel car covered? No. Is the little oil lamp that's used in a power outage covered? No. Okay, so it is basically stationary and installed equipment. Now, there's a couple words here you need to also know. They use shall, S-H-A-L-L, quite frequently. Basically that means it does or will. Okay, the standard, you could translate it like 114. The standard will also apply. Okay, so just shall means it does in code. Okay, the purpose of this standard is to provide minimum requirements for the safe installation of stationary liquid fuel burning appliances and all related accessories so as to prevent fires and explosions. Pretty straightforward. The purpose of this code is safety. Okay, retroactivity. The provisions of this standard reflect a consensus of what is necessary to provide an acceptable degree of protection from hazards addressed in the standard at the time the standard was issued. Unless otherwise specified, the provisions of the standard shall not apply to facilities, equipment, structures, or installation that existed or were approved for construction or installation prior to the effective date of this standard. Where specified, the provisions of this standard shall be retroactive. In other words, if the building or equipment was installed prior to whatever version of code you are working with in your area of jurisdiction, it does not apply. The prior, whatever code version was active at the time, applies. However, occasionally there's a specification that says, yes, it is retroactive. They do this when there's a serious safety hazard. If you are dealing with a situation where it is retroactive, you have to update. Okay? Now, if you change out a piece of equipment in a building that was built prior for a prior version of code, yes, the building officials are going to make you update the entire system to meet the new code. Okay, an example of this is oil lines and oil tanks. Okay, in many jurisdictions, underground tanks are no longer legal. So if you replace the entire oil furnace because a furnace went bad, heat exchanger cracked, or just the customer wants to update, it is very possible that they're going to make you remove the underground tank and put it above ground or in a basement tank. Okay, oil lines were originally allowed to run underneath the floors. They were put in and then the concrete was poured over them. That's no longer legal. Okay, they have to be in. So when you replace the piece of equipment, yes, you're going to have to change out the oil line, blow out and abandon the old one, and then put a new oil line in the protective sleeve above the concrete. So just be aware of things like that, okay? You can't just ignore the new standards, but look at retroactive and look at equipment replacement, what you're going to have to update. In cases where the authority having jurisdiction determines that the existing situation presents an unacceptable degree of risk, the authority having jurisdiction shall be permitted to apply retroactively any portions of this standard deemed appropriate. The retroactive requirements of this standard shall be permitted to be modified if their application clearly would be impractical in the judgment of the authority having jurisdiction, and only where it is clearly evident that a reasonable degree of safety is provided. New terminology in here. Authority having jurisdiction. That is your local building office, okay? Starts off at a national level. NFPA 31 is a national code. Each state then can adopt and modify the NFPA 31. They can't make it less strict, but they can add things to it to make it more strict. Okay, they can narrow it down and add to it. Okay, then once the state adopts it, sometimes cities and counties adopt it as well. So you have to make sure that you are actually dealing with it as the authority having jurisdiction, which is your local building office in the county, city, or state, depending on who's doing the inspections, that you've applied for a building permit with. Okay. Now, the easiest way to deal with this is call the building office if you have something unusual and say, how would you like me to handle this? That makes it easy for the building inspector and the code officials to say, okay, yeah, let's do it this way. Okay. And then you never have a problem with sign-offs, and they start to get to know that if there's something unusual, you're going to ask. Okay. Equivalency is chapter 1.5. Basically, it says nothing in the standard is intended to prevent the use of systems, methods, or devices or superior quality, strength, fire resistance, effectiveness, durability, and safety over those prescribed by this standard. Technical documentation shall be submitted to the authority having jurisdiction to determine equivalency. The system, method, or device shall be approved for the intended purpose by the authority having jurisdiction. What this is saying is we know that there's new methods, new equipment, new venting, new piping, okay, modernization happening at all times. Provide the technical documentation of the new methods to the code officials, get a sign off on it, and then use it. It's not saying we can't modernize, okay? So everything in this manual, yes, if there's something better, just prove it to the code officials, get approval in advance, and go with it. 1.6 talks about units. Okay, the units of this measure in this standard are presented first in U.S. customary units, inches per pound. International systems SI of units follow the inch-pound unit in parentheses. SI is an abbreviation of System International, or International System, or metric system of measurements. Okay, this is a U.S. code, okay, because we're different from the rest of the world, and we use inches and pounds. That is first, because that is our unit of measurement. However, NFPA does recognize that this is used in other countries as well as a code standard, so they give it in metric in parentheses following. Either system of units shall be acceptable for satisfying the requirements in the standard. Users of this standard shall apply one system of units consistently and not alternate between units. In other words, you can't choose the metric system when it behooves you and inches and pounds when it behooves you, okay? You have to use one or the other as you're doing work. The values presented for this measurement in this standard are expressed with a degree of precision appropriate for practical application and enforcement. It is not intended that the application and enforcement of these values be more precise than the precision expressed. In other words, get as close as you can, and I mean they don't want to nail you for being 1 centimeter or a millimeter off, okay, or a quarter inch, okay, or a tenth of an inch. Get it to what your tape measure shows for measurements, or what your gauges show for pressure, and you'll be fine. It's not to nitpick it to death. Where extracted text contains values expressed only in one system of units, the values in the extracted text have been retained without conversion to preserve the units established by the responsible technical committee in the source documents. Okay, some values that have been taken from other publications may only have one unit of measure or the other. Okay, so chapter 1 continues to go on in the same manner. Let's go back to the there. Okay, code adoption requirements is not in the chapter 1 yet. It's going to be added eventually because there's a lot of discussion going on over when they're going to have to be adopted. But again, just be able to find things in the chapter. Okay, NFPA 31, if you are doing oil work or any type of liquid fuel work with heating appliances, make very sure you have a copy of the NFPA 31 that is applicable to your local building office.